1. A strange kind of independence. I met him on a late autumn day when the maple leaves had turned a blazing red like fire against the cold gray sky. My car had gotten stuck on a dirt road leading into the Cascade Forest deep in the southern Oregon mountains, where there was nothing but pines rocks and a silence so thick you could hear your own breath. No cell signal, no gas station, not a soul in sight. I was fumbling around in the woods when he appeared, tall with a full head of silver hair and beard, wearing a thick wool sweater and holding an axe. No one had warned me about him. But the man, instead of being standoffish or wary, simply said gently, "If you wouldn't mind a cup of hot ginger tea, I can take you back to my place." I didn't have a better option. His cabin lay deep within an old faded turnoff with no signpost and no fence. The wooden steps creaked, the roof was moss-covered, and the windows were draped in coarse fabric like something out of an old oil painting. Inside was a different world, packed with books, charcoal drawings, and the sound of cello music playing from an old tape deck. There was the scent of toasted bread, dried herbs, and a strange, unfamiliar feeling of safety. There was no trace of a woman in that house, nor any sign of frequent visitors. "You can stay the night if the snow gets heavier," he said, pouring me a second cup of tea. "It gets dark fast up here." I looked around the room, handmade wooden furniture books organized by theme, and above the fireplace, the only photograph, a laughing little boy in a red knit hat. I didn't ask. He didn't explain. He just sat in silence, as if used to having strangers in his home without needing to tell them anything. I spent the night in a warm room, scented with pine wood and beeswax candles. The next morning, over a simple breakfast of scones and honey, I found myself asking, "How long have you lived here?" "Almost 20 years. "Isn't it lonely?" He didn't answer right away. He took a sip of tea, then set the cup down. "I don't live like this because I have no one. I live like this because I once had too much." That answer stayed with me the entire drive back. Alden Stone, that was his name, which I learned only later wasn't an odd old man. He was someone who had chosen to live differently, not running from society, but also not needing its noise, not worshiping solitude, but accepting it as part of a life lived on purpose. I used to think old people lived alone because they'd been left behind. But he wasn't like that. Every detail in his home, from the way he arranged his books, brewed his tea, to how he tended the little garden out back, showed that he wasn't surviving each day, he was living it fully and deliberately. "I'm not lonely," he once said in one of his rare moments of openness. "I just choose not to fill myself with things I don't need anymore." I asked if he ever feared illness or an accident in the forest where no one might find him. "Of course I do," he smiled. "But what scares me more is living a life where every decision has to pass through someone else." For him, independence wasn't about cutting others off. It was about reclaiming the right to live his own way after already giving up too much. I left just as the sun rose over the mountain ridge. In his hand was a lantern, the golden light blurred behind the morning mist. "Come back if you ever need some peace," he said with no trace of formality. And I did return many times, not because I needed help, but because I wanted to understand more about men like him, those who don't ask to be understood but leave you speechless when you begin to. 2. Connections that don't need to be called love. Each time I returned to Alden's cabin, I discovered something new. Not because he deliberately kept things hidden, but because he never rushed to share. With him, if you had the patience, you'd eventually see. The third time I came caught by a sudden forest downpour. Before I could descend the mountain, he was sitting at his desk, writing something in black ink on pale yellow rice paper. When I stepped in, he didn't hide it. He simply pulled out a chair. "Just a letter," he said. I asked who he was writing to. "An old friend, someone I haven't seen in over 30 years. Then he smiled. "We still write each other every month. Sometimes we don't even say anything new, just share what we ate that day, how many onions we planted. But that's enough to keep the thread from breaking." I sat quietly for a long time. In an era where messages vanish in seconds, who still has the patience for handwritten letters mailed and waiting a week to arrive? To him, the most important connections didn't require daily presence. They didn't need labels like love or closeness. They only needed to be real. I used to think living alone meant being closed off. But his house, though inhabited by only one man, bore the traces of many souls who had once passed through. A wool scarf hanging behind the door, he said it was from a college friend who mailed one every Christmas. A tin of Earl Grey tea you could only find in England, sent by a former student. A sheet of handwritten piano music with a note scribbled in the corner. "Still remember what you said about that march." N? I asked. You've never lived with anyone since. He knew what I was about to ask, even though I didn't finish the sentence. No, he said. And not because I couldn't, but because I no longer need a relationship to prove I'm not alone. He once tried to open his heart to a woman in the nearby town. They had coffee talked, went to a few concerts, but eventually he pulled away quietly as he always did. I realized I still enjoy sharing, he said, but I no longer need attachment in that form. For me, connection isn't about marital status or how many dates you go on. It's about who understands you without needing you to explain. I remembered that night, he turned on his old radio, adjusted the dial slowly, and a late-night broadcast came through the voice of a middle-aged woman telling a story about the oak tree she planted after her husband died. He listened intently, saying nothing, sipping his tea. She's all the way in Maine, he said, but I've listened to her for 10 years. Some people don't need to know each other's faces. It's enough just knowing they exist somewhere at a familiar hour. Then I understood he wasn't lacking in affection. He had simply chosen a kind of love that was quiet, undemanding, a love that survives time through silence and respect. In a corner of his home, he had a map pinned with red tacks marking various cities, places where a friend once lived, where a former student had sent a postcard, where his father had been stationed during the war. Under each pin was a note: James, 31968, Military Hospital Corridor, Clara, Welland 9997, poetry reading in Vermont. Each pin was a testament that though he lived alone, he had never been separate from the world. 3. The health and discipline of a solitary man. One November morning before the sky had fully lightened, I woke up in the attic room of Alden's cabin to the sound of fire crackling downstairs. When I came down, he was already dressed in his coat and worn leather boots, ready for a journey I hadn't yet imagined. Morning walk. You coming? He asked, as if inviting me for a stroll around the block, though we were about to step into a forest below freezing. I agreed, partly out of curiosity, partly because I didn't want to miss the chance to see the world through the eyes of someone who lived alone, yet never seemed bound by fatigue or the decay of old age. The walk began from the dirt trail just past his cabin through a grove of pines, dripping mist onto our shoulders. We walked in silence, hearing only the crunch of boots on dry leaves and the soft breath of the wind. Every morning he walked nearly 4 kilometers, not out of medical obligation, but simply because it was how he kept pace with life. The body's the one thing I still have control over, he said, half joking, at least until it stops listening. He followed no strict dietary rules. His meals were simple: rye bread, vegetable soup, a few apple slices, or a piece of homemade cheese. No canned food, no refined sugar. On his kitchen shelf hung bundles of dried herbs, mint, sage, chamomile, all ingredients for the teas he drank before bed. No sleeping pills, no therapist, just habits maintained with a kind of discipline no one imposed on him. I remind myself to take my heart meds at 8 a.m. every day. If I forget, no one else will. So I've learned to remember, he said, carefully organizing a small wooden box of pills with the precision of a watchmaker. He told me about a time a few years back when he slipped while shoveling snow after a storm. His knee swelled up and he couldn't stand. He didn't panic. He crawled back home, braced the knee, iced it, and tuned the radio to the emergency channel. It took rescue crews nearly 4 hours to reach him. I'm not afraid of dying, he said. I just don't want to die stupidly because I forgot to check for ice underfoot. I realized then living alone doesn't mean being lonely. It means learning to become your own most demanding life partner. His discipline wasn't rigid. It was soft, like the stone circles he arranged around flower beds, like the notes he jotted in his notebook: cold season, starting remember to mulch the apple roots. When we live with others, we often hand over parts of our lives to them, our schedules, our meals, even our moods. But not Alden. He lived as if he were caring for a precious living being, and that being was himself. In a corner of the cabin he had a meditation mat, a few small candles, and an hourglass. Every night he sat there for 20 minutes. No phone, no distractions, just him with himself. You know, he once said people aren't afraid of being alone. They're afraid of facing themselves when there's no one around to keep them distracted. I think he was right. Living alone doesn't teach you how to escape emotion. It forces you into its deepest chambers, the very ones most try to avoid, and makes you learn how to stay there calm as if in a candlelit room. 4. The money and honor of a self-sufficient man. I never imagined someone who lived as simply as Alden might have considerable wealth. His wooden cabin offered no sign of affluence, modest furnishings, humble belongings, and worn, time-worn objects. Even the wall clock had stopped ticking some winter long ago, and he kept it not for its function, but as a memento. But everything I assumed about him changed after a trip to the local bank to make a transfer. The teller, an older woman named Rita, who also knew of Alden, though had barely exchanged more than a few words with him, leaned toward me and whispered after recognizing me from earlier that week. "You know, he has a huge investment account, always withdraws with precision on schedule. No one knows what he used to do, but he lives like someone who's never needed anyone to answer for him." I wasn't surprised by the amount, but by how he'd never let it show. To Alden, money wasn't a tool to impress. It was a quiet kind of power enough to let him live by what he believed in without needing to justify it. One afternoon, while he was sorting seeds on the porch, I casually asked, "What did you do before you lived here?" He gave a small smile, not hiding anything. "I was a strategic advisor for startups. Back then, people liked paying for advice, but few cared to listen." Then he paused, fingers gently rolling a mustard seed. "After I lost my son, I found I had no more interest in helping people succeed in the market's eyes. I just wanted to live on my own terms. I didn't press further. Some losses need no elaboration. Some reasons for stepping back can be fully understood in a single sentence." From that moment, I started noticing how he spent his money. Every week he'd go into town to buy a few vegetables, some dark chocolate, and maybe an old book if he found a good one. He wore no designer brands used, no modern tech, made no flashy purchases. But he helped quietly. Each month he mailed books to the local library. Each year he anonymously contributed to scholarships for low-income students. Sometimes he'd ask me to deliver a small sum to a family of immigrants starting a bakery business. When I asked why he didn't let them know it was from him, he simply shrugged. "They don't need to know it's me. They just need to know someone's out there rooting for them." To him, financial management wasn't just about numbers, it was part of his dignity. He managed his retirement plans, insurance, even his will, all kept neatly in a small safe, built into the floor, the key hanging on a silver chain he always wore around his neck. "I don't want to leave this world and have someone deal with the mess I left behind," he said. "True freedom means you can arrange your own ending." That sentence silenced me. At an age when many people live through dependency on their children, on pensions, on partners, Alden chose to live by honor. He owed his existence to no one. He refused to let the fear of scarcity make him betray his principles. One evening, as we listened to Brahms's Autumn Symphony, he said, "Money gives me peace not to chase anything anymore. I don't need much, just enough so I never have to live against my own heart." I believe that for him, every dollar he spent carried this unspoken question, will this help me live more truthfully? And perhaps for that reason, he never let money blur the character of a man who had once stepped out of the crowd without bitterness. 5. The storm that night and an untold truth. The storm came without warning, like most storms in the Cascade Mountains. The sky turned to lead, and wind battered the windows as if trying to tear apart the little wooden house in the woods. I had planned to return to town that afternoon, but low-hanging clouds and snow falling like thick salt kept me there another night. Alden didn't seem rattled. He lit the stove earlier than usual, added a few candles, and brought out a half-open bottle of red wine. The house grew warm in an odd, comforting way, like resting in the belly of an old, heavy animal, ancient but safe. We had a simple dinner: cauliflower soup, toasted bread, and a few slices of pungent cheese. When the wind began to howl, Alden pulled out a stack of papers from a drawer, their edges yellowed with age. I thought it was a manuscript he'd been drafting, but it wasn't. He said, "If I don't make it through the night, please send this to the address on the envelope." I laughed out loud, thinking he was joking. But his eyes held no trace of humor. They were deep, quiet, and absolutely clear, like the eyes of someone who had prepared for this long ago. I stammered, "You're fine. There's nothing to worry about." He didn't answer. He just stroked the edge of the envelope as if touching a distant memory. Then he began to speak in a voice so calm it chilled me more than the wind outside. "Emily Winslow, Boston. The only woman I ever loved. The one I married. We separated after losing our son when he was 8, not because we stopped loving each other, but because we couldn't stand beside one another without hearing his voice echoing from the space between us. I didn't know what to say. The room no longer felt like shelter, but a chamber of memories suddenly unlocked, filled with broken pieces, shadowed corners, and a soul that had once loved, lost, and chosen silence over holding on. After that, he continued, I moved away. No contact, no remarriage. She didn't remarry either. We lived two parallel lives, but I kept one habit every year on our son's birthday. I wrote her a letter. Never sent. I looked down at the envelope in my hand, realizing now how thick it was. Dozens of letters, maybe. A whole quiet life pressed into something so fragile. I asked why send it now. He didn't look at me. His gaze turned to the window where snow was covering the roof outside. Because some things, if kept silent too long, will one day be lost with no one left to hear them. That night I didn't sleep well. The wind seeped through the eaves, the snow whispered against the walls, and the image of the old man sitting with his hand resting on the envelope, eyes closed, as if afraid to let go of what little he had left, haunted me. The next morning the sky was cruelly clear. Alden was still there, sitting by the window sipping coffee like any other day. We're still here, he said, half smiling. I kept my promise. When I returned to the city, I mailed the envelope to the handwritten address. I didn't know if Emily still lived there or if she was even alive. But a week later, I received a postcard from Boston. The handwriting was shaky but legible. Alden kept his promise, as he always did. Tell him I still listen to music every Sunday morning like we used to. I gave him the postcard one afternoon in December. He looked at it for a long while, then folded it, placed it on the table like a gift that needed no unwrapping. No tears, no outward emotion. Just a nod, the kind a man gives when he's come full circle and can finally say, I did what was right. 6 ending, quiet and deep. I left the cabin on a morning of crystal skies. Snow clung to the pine branches and the sunlight broke through the leaves, scattering like glass. Alden stood on the porch, cup of tea in hand, his tall figure casting no shadow, as if he had already become part of the forest, the cabin, the wind of December. I didn't say goodbye. I knew he didn't need to hear it. A man like him, after traveling to the far ends of grief, has no reason to hold on anymore. No person, no time, no memory needs to be clung to in order to exist. He had learned how to let things go peacefully, even himself. On the drive back, I didn't turn on the radio or check the map. I let the car follow the winding road down the slope, as if trying to prolong the feeling of having once listened to a man who needed no noise to be extraordinary. Afterwards, I still received postcards from Emily now and then. She never wrote much, just a few lines. The lilacs bloomed early this year, or the Brahms symphony reminded me of someone who was beautiful in silence. Not a word about love, but every letter was proof that something real had once existed and still did, like a seed beneath the frost, not dead, but waiting for the right season to bloom again. I don't know when Alden will be gone, but I know this for sure: he lived a full life. No stage, no audience, just a small cabin, a few friends who wrote him letters, a piece of music every evening, and choices he never had to regret. If you ever meet a man who lives alone, don't pity him too quickly. Maybe he doesn't need anyone by his side to feel whole. Maybe he once loved deeply, lost deeply, and chose to continue on a quiet but steady path. Because sometimes silence isn't emptiness, it's the echo of a life that has ripened, that knows what it means to be enough. You're listening to this story on Light of Wise Elders, where we share quiet, meaningful, deeply human journeys of those who might seem forgotten. If today's story moved you, leave a comment, share your thoughts, and subscribe to stay with us for more stories to come. Because every elder was once young, and every wrinkle carries an untold story. Thank you for listening. We hope to see you in the next video.